This is a profound topic. It's a great deal of debate in the conservative intellectual community about nationalism and its purpose and its value. And of course, the superficial explanation for this effervescence on this issue is that it's due to Donald Trump, that he's asserting American greatness, and therefore that this is a topic of conversation. But I would argue, to tee up this conversation, that it goes much deeper than that, that the West fought two brutal wars in the last century, and after those wars, there was a consensus among the intellectual class in the West that nationalism was a bad thing, that these wars, the theory goes, were motivated by a kind of malevolent nationalism that caused the wars, and we need to suppress that. So in the post-Cold War world in the United States, for example, we adopted something called liberal democracy. And liberal democracy is a process. It's not content. It's not tradition. It's protecting certain rights, right to vote, right to free speech, all those things. And it is now argued by many conservative intellectuals that the adoption of this type of contentless democracy in the United States has killed it, that liberalism is dead. And many, I don't need to name them, conservative intellectuals are saying conservatism is dead. Liberal democracy rejected Burke's idea that society is a contract between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born, and there are certain healthy conservative traditions that need to be passed down. Liberal democracy rejected all that, and what we've seen is the atrophy of traditional institutions, the family, churches, and we've also seen our politics become more coarse, our culture become more coarse, and that liberalism is kind of a failed project because it's without content. That's a subject for another panel. Our panel is about foreign policy today. So I can argue that a similar thing happened in foreign policy, where after the Second World War, it began with Wilsonianism, and I recommend, John wrote a great review of a book about American conservative nationalism, where he says the Wilsonian project was to create a new international system in which progressive liberal values would be vindicated worldwide. And the beginning of this liberal internationalism sought to move beyond the nation state and move beyond balance of power. So set up a process that avoids national interests, avoids balance of power, and all those bad things that led to the great wars. And this international system will protect peace and prosperity. Now, many foreign policy intellectuals are vested in this whole international system and system of alliances that were set up, all the international institutions that were set up. And I would argue, just like in the domestic context, those institutions we are seeing that those institutions are not protecting American national interests. When it comes to the great international institutions, the UN, trade organizations, and others, it can be argued that China gamed the system to the detriment of the United States economy and national security. And you can go beyond that, even our alliance structure. It can be argued that the alliance structure, as it currently existed, is detrimental to the American national interest, that there's a lot of freeloading going on. We're getting put in dangerous positions because of our alliance relationships. And so Donald Trump came along and said, you know, this is not working. There needs to be a correction. And again, I would argue, and I recommend Donald Trump's, the author of Donald Trump's national security strategy is a woman named Nadia Shadlow. And while I don't agree with everything in this article, she wrote an article in Foreign Affairs recently called The End of American Illusion, in which she argued that, look, that Trump didn't come from Mars. Many of these international institutions and alliances were not in the American interest, and there needed to be a correction. So let me start with that and turn to each of you. Maybe we'll start with Bob on my left. One, is there going to be a correction? Are we going to move towards a foreign policy that's more prone to protect American interests and not bow to international organizations? But two, is that correction, more importantly, is that correction going to be a healthy one? Is it going to be a correction towards a more restrained foreign policy, the foreign policy of kind of realism and restraint that, you know, the George Washington's inaugural farewell address recommended? So one, is there a correction? And two, coming, is it a healthy correction?
Let me try to answer that by talking about sort of the fate and the future of nationalism and where we are with regard to nationalism. Bill outlined pretty well what sort of emerged in terms of nationalist thinking and why. But I would argue that we're at a real crossroads. One could raise the question about whether Biden's election is going to significantly alter that crossroads, but I'll get to that in a second. John Mearsheimer gave a provocative and very interesting speech to the American Political Science Association recently. He received a prestigious award, the Madison Award, and the speech was published later in the ASPA magazine, the name of which I can't remember right now, PS, in which he said that nationalism and liberalism, broadly defined, are in major clash. And they're in major clash in significant part because liberalism, as Bill was describing, had become almost hegemonic in its influence over the American polity, American culture, and American thinking, and American discourse, to the extent that it set out to marginalize or even nullify whatever vestiges of nationalism there were in the country in the context that Bill described. And he said something very interesting. He said that in a unipolar world, when the United States doesn't have the kinds of enemies that breed nationalistic thinking or even fervor or necessity, and when liberalism can run rampant, we have the kind of a situation that we've had since the end of the Cold War. But can only go so far, because nationalism strikes back hard. And he said that nationalism almost always wins because it is the most powerful ideology in the modern world. So we've been struggling. We've got, I totally agree that Trump is a manifestation of that and a manifestation of the hard strike back of nationalism against the zeitgeist that had been running rampant in America since the end of the Cold War. But so the question becomes, what is that? Will it ultimately succeed? And I think the answer is generally yes. I think we suffered a setback here with this election, but I think that Mearsheimer has it basically right. But what does that mean in terms of foreign policy? Well, I sort of hate to say this, but there's a fundamental aspect of American foreign policy, and if you're into realism and restraint, it gets to the realism side, which is that America is an empire, whether we like it or not. We're not a colonial empire, and therefore we can sort of indulge ourselves the conceit that we actually aren't an empire, but we are. And China's an empire, and Russia certainly wants to be, certainly in terms of its immediate neighborhood that's been part of its sphere of influence for centuries, which in my view we ought to allow, but also in terms of that Eurasian heartland that Mackinder said was the fundamental aspect of global influence. India wants to be an empire. And don't forget the EU. It's basically an empire, 27 countries under the aegis and the control of a bureaucracy that only sort of marginally has to respond to the wishes of the people under its domain. And that's America. But I would argue, and I'm going to just leave it at this, I'm going to try to sort of drop a little provocative thought into this for future discussion up here. And that is, there's dumb imperialism and there's smart imperialism. And America has been practicing dumb imperialism since the end of the Cold War. And my hope would be that when nationalism emerges, and we can talk about how and why it can have the influence that we may hope that it does, when it emerges, my hope is that we can sort of switch over from dumb imperialism to smart imperialism. Thanks.
Well, we started the discussion by noting that the backlash against nationalism started with 2 wars. And I think the rise of nationalism now started with a war, and that's the Iraq War. People from my generation, if you ask them what's the first significant world event that you remember, a lot of them will tell you it's 9/11. And therefore, they also remember that for the majority of their lives, we've been fighting a war abroad that has no end and no real specific goal in mind, and certainly nothing involved that really advances the American interest. So the rise of Trump in many ways was related to that. Of course, there were also significant domestic changes that led to the rise of Trump, but his foreign policy was one that was a backlash to the establishment order that demanded the U.S. spread its values abroad while not really having any to spread at home. And my concerns now for whether or not this policy of restraint is going to be continued is that, one, Trump has a lot of people who despise him. So the concern is that him being the messenger of this will perhaps inspire a backlash that's not rooted in any logic or sense, but just because they don't like who's spreading the message. And then, of course, the election of Joe Biden really threatens a return to the status quo. But generally, one thing that inspires optimism is this realignment of politics on the nationalist right and the progressive left. And they agree on much more than economics. They agree on foreign policy as well, and having a policy of restraint and not isolationism, but a more isolationist bent than what we've had before. So I do think that there's reason to think that ultimately a foreign policy rooted in nationalism will prevail.
When I think of nationalism, we're talking about democratic nationalism. We're talking about the right of a people to determine their own policy. I'm going to read Trump, just one paragraph from what Trump told the United Nations. I think this is crucial. He said, "Sovereignty and independent nations are the only vehicles where freedom has ever survived, democracy has ever endured, or peace has ever prospered. And so we must protect our sovereignty and our cherished independence above all." So essentially, the way I would conceptualize the world, not so much nationalism versus liberalism, but a democratic nationalism or democratic sovereignty versus global governance. Most important issue in politics, who decides? So who makes these decisions? What the Trump foreign policy and Trumpism and we call democratic nationalism was about is Americans will make these decisions. They won't be made by the International Criminal Court. They won't be made by the UN Global Migration Council, the Paris Accords. He got out of many of these because it was essentially a question of sovereignty. Arrayed against him, of course, are the forces of global governance, which were the forces of liberal internationalism. We know who they are. It would include, obviously, the leadership of the European Union, which doesn't actually believe in democratic sovereignty. It's sort of a judicial administrative oligarchy where decisions are made only at the elite level in the European Union. Also, of course, the organizations of the United Nations. And besides that, I would say there's also, very important, is the role of NGOs and essentially big philanthropy. The Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, Stuart Mott, Atlantic Philanthropies, George Soros. They're giving tremendous amounts of money to non-governmental organizations, NGOs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First. And what these NGOs are doing in UN conferences is actually working against democratic nation states. In the negotiations for the International Criminal Court, Human Rights First actually represented some developing nations because they couldn't afford to send representatives. So fine, the Ford Foundation, paid for Human Rights First to be on the floor, writing the messages, countering U.S. positions, and actually working against United States, the representatives of the United States at the Rome conference. So this is the politics. This is part of the politics of the future. The Germans call this Weltinnenpolitik, global domestic politics, where actors outside of the nation state are involved, sometimes allied with nation states. Or you have sort of post-sovereign states, like Germany, which essentially is a modern, post-sovereign nation state where they prefer to work with NGOs. So this is, I think, this is what Trump stood up against, and we'll see how this election turns out. Biden would be a return to the forces of global governance. But I think this democratic nationalism, democratic sovereignty, is now entrenched on the right because of Trump. And so there'll be an argument on the right. There'll be an attempt to move back to more of an interventionist approach. But I think the democratic sovereignist wing is now established. And the argument now, we can get into a little later, is whether this means restraint or intervention, whether it's Tom Cotton or Rand Paul, or some combination. I think it's some combination. I'll get to that a little later when we have some more questions.
Yeah, I'd like to hone in on that, because we're all in agreement that nationalism is reasserting itself, not just because of Trump, but because of what Mearsheimer notices and what's happening in the world, and the nationalism inevitably reasserts itself. But there are strains of nationalism that are not healthy. I mean, I would argue there are certain people that claim America is so exceptional, she can't do anything wrong in the world, and we should be projecting because of our great national system, we should be projecting power everywhere in the world and overturning regimes and doing a lot of mischief. And that argument is based on a certain form of nationalism. So as nationalism reasserts itself, which direction do you think we're going to go? Are we going to go in this American exceptionalism direction, or are we going to go in the direction to say, well, it's in the American national interest to really mind our own business in a lot of places?
Well, I would say that what you described was the neocon ethos, and it came very close to capturing the Republican foreign policy establishment in the post-Cold War period, certainly after the Iraq invasion and 9/11. Trump essentially kicked those people out of the Republican Party. And the question that we're going to be asking and watching now is whether they're going to make their way back into the Republican Party. And if they do, and Tom Cotton's a good example, if they do, then we're going to be sort of back to square one in terms of how do we leverage this into something that's going to be beneficial to the country, and also, I would argue, the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. If Trump does end up losing this election, which looks likely, and we watch as the Republican Party heads towards 2024 and looking at who the nominee is going to be, if you have a Tom Cotton or a Nikki Haley, the neocons are going to reemerge and reestablish themselves in the party. It would be up to some of the more populist and thereby restraint-minded individuals in the Republican Party who are running in 2024 to keep them out. But right now, the neocons are essentially dead. They run a thing called the Lincoln Project that cuts ads and grifts for a living. If you would have thought that 5 years ago that the neocons would be grifters, I mean, everyone would just laugh in your face. So the idea that we've gotten to this point obviously inspires a lot of optimism, but the Republican Party has not shifted all the way just yet. They've started to accept a form of nationalism. They've seen what Trump's done with asserting himself against the World Health Organization, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, withdrawing troops from Syria, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, and they didn't see what all of the foreign policy experts predicted, which was a collapse of the Middle East and America being embarrassed and shut out on the world stage. And they've realized that there is actually some benefit to what Trump has been doing during his first term. And that's led some Republicans who otherwise probably would have completely embraced the George Bush foreign policy to be a bit more accepting of this new policy of restraint. It's just a matter of whether those people are going to continue to embrace it once Trump is gone and once they can go back to whatever they were doing before. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there are enough people in the party who have accepted it and embraced it all the way to continue that shift, or whether we're going to start reverting back to where we were before.
I think Walter Russell Mead's formulation is sort of useful to look at the future of the Republican foreign policy. Remember the 4 traditions of American politics: Jeffersonian, which was non-intervention; Jacksonian, which was sort of don't tread on me, you hit them back hard, but it's not no nation building or any of that sort of thing; Hamiltonian, which is the emphasis on economic power, use of commerce; and Wilsonian, of course, make the world safe for democracy. Taking those 4 and taking Wilsonian, saying there's 2 forms of Wilsonianism. So there's an addendum to Mead. There's hard Wilsonian, that would be George W. Bush 43, the second inaugural address, the Freedom Agenda. We're not safe until the entire world is free, so use of force and so on. Hard Wilsonianism. Then there's the soft Wilsonian, that would be Obama, Biden, the use of international organizations. So if you take that, what's the, we'll think of a Republican foreign policy. Let's take an example of sort of what Bush did, and maybe there's some disagreement probably in this room on this, is the killing of Soleimani. So how would you fit that into the 4 or the 5, actually the 5 foreign policy schemes? I'd say that was Jacksonian. That was pure Jacksonian. You go take them out, that's it. A hard Wilsonian policy would be, let's do more, let's overthrow the Iranian regime, let's have kinetic action. That's hard Wilsonian. Soft Wilsonian, the Obama, well, let's go to the UN, let's work our way back to that. Jeffersonian would probably be non-intervention. This is too much of a, it might be a threat. It's not something we probably shouldn't assassinate him. But Hamiltonian would be the use of, let's use economic power, and Trump has done that too. So what we have is Trump has combined, and I think this is sort of the future of nationalist foreign policy. He's combined Jacksonian and Hamiltonian, rejecting both forms of Wilsonian and Jeffersonian to an extent. Now, one of Mead's points was that all of these themes are used even by everybody at some point. So there would be some Jeffersonian, I think, non-restrained, although I think you'd have the more Jacksonian Hamiltonian, as I said. So there's some, there would be some withdrawal from that. But that's how I think it's going to be this sort of conflict between, you might say, the Jacksonian plus Hamiltonian against the Wilsonian. We're talking about neoconservatives would be obviously they'd be the hard Wilsonians in this.
So I think we're all in agreement that the Republican Party is in the midst of a food fight between all these different factions. The neocons are on their back, but they still have many, many allies, powerful allies in the Congress and elsewhere. So it's going to be fought out. And whether Trumpism wins, we don't know.
Let me make one more point on that, because you use all 4 of these theories. Trump, there would even be some Wilsonian rhetoric, at least. And that's what this human rights initiative that Pompeo launched is and when we have a public diplomacy, if we're going to be involved in there will be some kind of confrontation with China. Americans will be talking about human rights, so there'll be some use, even of the most Jacksonian or Hamiltonian of Wilsonian rhetoric. We will be talking about we're for freedom, they're not. You're going to hear this from any administration, whether it was Biden or Trump or Kamala Harris or Pence, whatever it is. The Wilsonian rhetoric is going to be employed, even if the policies are more Jeffersonian or Jacksonian.
Well, let's talk about a Biden administration potentially. Biden is in many ways a traditional Council on Foreign Relations liberal internationalist. I mean, that's the way he acted in the Congress. That was his rhetoric. But if we're all in agreement that nationalism is going to in some way reassert itself in the American polity, no matter which party's in charge, that it's an inevitable trend. How does that manifest itself in a Biden administration, Bob? How does nationalism, which is on the march, sort of manifest itself in policy changes in a Biden administration?
I don't think it will very much. I agree that Biden is going to be probably soft Wilsonian, maybe verging towards hard Wilsonian. The Wilson ethos was, you go back and read his speeches, he was very uncomfortable. It gave him the willies to think about America going into the world for any purpose that was beneficial to America. Only if it was humanitarian in purpose could he get excited about it. And that's essentially the sensibility that has been driving democratic humanitarian Wilsonism, certainly in the post-Cold War period. So they're going to continue the assault on nationalism, and those of us who sort of fall into that category are going to be beleaguered, and the media is going to be jumping on the bandwagon there, and so we're going to have to husband our resources and hunker down and establish our strategies. But this is not going to be a pleasant time.
And Biden's a complete phony, by the way, because he claimed while running that he was going to be tougher on China than Trump and that he's going to renegotiate all of these trade deals in a better way than Trump. But Biden's entire career in politics was actually selling out the working class in America and doing the exact opposite of what he campaigned on. He voted for normalizing trade relations with China. He voted for NAFTA. And the idea that he's suddenly going to grow a backbone after 47 years is so ridiculous. One development I do think we'll see, which is going to be really fun for all of us to watch, is that Biden, if he does get really more interventionist and start doing things like trying to topple regimes or get involved in more wars or send troops back to Afghanistan, we'll see the squad actually push back on him. And you're going to have a similar fight on the left, I believe, from the progressives. And you're going to have the AOCs running around Congress arguing about their own president. And Biden is going to have to figure out how he toes that line within his own party when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, I think the heart of Biden's, the core intellectual, ideological center is liberal internationalism. I'm thinking here, I'm going to read a paragraph by three leading liberal internationalists that most of you have heard of, everybody knows here: John Eikenberry, Joseph Nye, Robert Cohen. They're sort of the core liberal internationalists. And Eikenberry wrote this, and he's supported by Nye and Cohen. How do we reconcile the international liberal vision of increasing authority above the nation states, where there's pooling of sovereignty, with domestic liberal democracy built on popular sovereignty? Of course, that can't be reconciled. So again, I guess there'll be this push toward global governance, about transferring, this is the most important issue, in my view, in the world. You're transferring political authority from democratic nation states to non-democratic international, transnational organizations. So we'll return to that. We got a lot of it done under Obama. There was a total rejection of this under Trump, and now we'll be going back to it. But this has been the push, whether it's hard Wilsonian or soft Wilsonian, this has been the push since the end of the Cold War.
Well, since our panel is standing between the audience and lunch, I'm going to ask a culture war question to try to get the juices flowing. So let me play the devil's advocate on the reassertion of American nationalism. So yes, it's possible that American nationalism will reassert itself, and this is an inevitable trend. But it's also the case that universally among elite American cultural institutions, those elites don't believe in the American experiment. They're not nationalists in any sense. If you go to America's universities, America's major media institutions, many of the cultural institutions that dominate the United States are not nationalists in any way. They don't even believe in the American project. How does American nationalism, which has to assume a certain pride in American traditions and the American experiment. How does it reassert itself in this cultural environment? Let me just turn to Bob and we'll go down the line again.
Well, I think that's the fundamental question. You're right. The elite institutions, whether you're talking about the big universities or big tech, big finance, big corporations, most of big media, the foundations on trusts, all these things are very much in the internationalist, globalist tradition, to the extent that it's a tradition. As I say, they're going to be pushing very, very hard now. They're pushing against Trump, but at least he was in the White House. I'm going to say something about that in a minute too, but not here. So we're going to be back to where we were. We're going to be in the corner. We're going to be against the wall, and we're going to have to pull ourselves together, and we're going to have to articulate what the situation is and what needs to be done until such time as we're in a position to do that. I'm going to reserve my comments about Trump for a minute, just let these other colleagues talk.
Yeah, I agree that's going to be one of the biggest challenges, because when you have an entire culture that is against this strain of ideology, it's incredibly difficult for people to fight back. One of the things that the Trump administration did for people who see the bias of the universities, of Hollywood, of the sports leagues now, was they felt he gave them a voice to fight back against those institutions, even when they didn't really have very much power. And in order for nationalism to ultimately be successful, there has to be some type of tearing down and rebuilding that occurs with those institutions. And obviously a Biden presidency is going to delay that process by 4 to 8 years. There are individuals in Congress, and then there were some in the Trump administration that made some gains. The Republican Party is obviously a lot more bullish, for example, on antitrust in relation to big tech. Secretary Pompeo was dismantling the Confucius Institutes that were exerting Chinese influence in the universities, as well as investigating the theft of research and intellectual property that was then going back to the Chinese government. And all of that's going to be on hold for a while. And the question is if the nationalists who are still in government can keep that momentum going when they don't have control of the administrative state.
Yeah, I would say with democratic sovereigns have to seize the moral high ground, which is essentially we believe America is essentially positive and you believe it's negative. And we believe essentially that Americans should rule themselves, where you want America to be ruled by other people through global governance. One other point I wanted to mention was, we've talked about, we think about intervention, usually think military, kinetic intervention, but there's ideological intervention, and that's what we're talking, this is what we're talking about here in terms of the culture. You look at Freedom House, you look at National Endowment for Democracy. These are National NED, National Endowment for Democracy, is funded entirely by the U.S. government. It's kind of has appropriations in Congress. Freedom House is now almost entirely funded by the federal government. If you look carefully at what these institutions are doing, they're not actually promoting liberal democracy or American constitutionalism in the world. They're promoting woke progressivism. If you look at you read their journals, they're not nonpartisan. They're very partisan. There were attacks on Trump. There were attacks on Brexit. So attacks on actually every right of center party in the West by both Freedom House and NED. They're saying these people are, authoritarians, they're nativists, they're xenophobes. So this under Biden, it'll be full speed ahead on ideological interference and intervention, but this ideological intervention is going to be post-American woke progressivism. It's not going to be traditional Americans. Now the problem with an institution like NED, which was, did work was created during the Cold War. Carl Gershman was the president. He took over in the 1980s. He's still there. they've shifted from they were nonpartisan in the 80s. It was anti-communist Cold War, but now it's partisan, essentially transnational progressive is the term I like to use, left global progressive. They are transnational progressives, and they've opposed conservatives at every turn. The problem is the Republicans in Congress are supporting them because they're still in a sort of a Cold War mentality. So Republican chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, this and that, they're going to say, oh yes, Ned will need more than ever now because they'll be fighting China. So this situation will get a lot worse under Biden, where under Trump or in the future, this is something we should take a very hard look at.
Let me say something about Donald J. Trump. He possessed a brilliant instinctual function which allowed him to understand what was going on in American politics when no one else who was running for president in 2016 of either party, including Bernie, understood it all, perceived it all. Just go back and think about Jeb Bush, who couldn't even answer the question about his brother's war and thought that immigration was an act of love, illegal immigration was an act of love, and therefore we ought to think of it that way in terms of policy making. He had no concept of what was going on in American politics. Trump did. However, Trump has an inadequate intellectual function, which made it impossible for him, and also we could get into his traits of temperament, made it impossible for him to build on that knot of support that he created in 2016 as a result of what he was able to see that no one else could see. And the result was that he was a failed president. The reason we're sitting here talking about it, this whole situation the way we are, is because Donald Trump, and I would argue that in terms of foreign policy, he didn't get us out of any wars, didn't get us into any new wars, didn't get us out of any places overseas. He didn't really formulate a conceptual framework for American foreign policy that could be explained to the American people and the world. And you failed in a host of other ways, and failed presidents don't get reelected. So here we are. We have Joe Biden. And Trump has sort of energized the opposition. And so that's a very unfortunate development. It would have been much better had somebody managed to emerge, there wasn't anybody, it turns out, who could have not only gotten elected in 2016, understanding those underlying powerful currents in American politics, but also translate that into a governing coalition that could be ongoing for a term or two. Very unfortunate.
So, Bob, let me follow up on that. Who's next? So, if Trump didn't really have the intellectual ability to articulate what his political instincts understood, that we can't send working class kids into meat grinders in the Middle East for no reason, that international institutions aren't really protecting the United States. He had all those instincts, and he didn't know how to put personnel in place that would execute a sound strategy. All of those, I'll agree with all those things. Who's out there? Who's out there that could inherit a lot of the good things about the Trump mantle, but then actually execute on it in a way that would not be a failed presidency? Who's going to be there in 2024?
You're asking me?
I'll ask anybody. Please, everybody jump in, because, I don't see anybody. But I could.
I'll give you an answer. Tucker Carlson.
I agree 100%. I don't think he'll ever do it, but but I do think that's the
Or
best
maybe
answer.
Senator Hawley, if you want to be more conventional.
Right. I mean, Senator Hawley, I think, has presidential ambitions. My concern about him is I don't think he has the charisma. Part of what made Trump so appealing, and people talk about, they hate Trump's personality and they love his policies, but they don't like his tweets. But I don't think that's entirely true. I think that's what people tell themselves to feel better about the fact that they love the entertainment and the charisma of Trump, and they actually find him very appealing. And one of the most difficult things post-Trumpism is how do you get someone who continues to advance those policies but is able to say them in a way that does appeal to the working man. Because Trump was, I actually disagree with you, I think Trump was able to, in some ways, communicate these policies in a way that was very appealing and very easy to understand for everyday Americans. And when you start having a politician who perhaps is too intellectual, too high-minded about it, then all of a sudden you have people feeling that this is a bit elitist again. And that's where the challenge comes in.
Yeah, a word we haven't used on this panel, which we should have, is America first. I mean, we made it very clear. He pointed the way. This is an America first foreign policy. We're going to be American interest. Then you argue about what that is, but that was clear enough. I mean, he kept repeating over and over. We're always put America first. I mean, I'm focusing here on his UN speeches, which I think were fantastic. Both the first two in 18 and 19, well, 17 and 18, where he made that clear. He also made sort of a general world argument. He said, this applies to you people too. You leaders should put your countries first as well, and then actually it'd be better for peace and cooperation if we do it this way. So I think this was very articulate, and I think that he did set the tone, and obviously there were the rough edges and all that, but he certainly pointed it in the direction. Now it's up to somebody else to pick it, but America first, the vision there is democratic sovereignty. It's very clear.
One of my favorites was the Warsaw speech.
Yeah, absolutely.
It drove the globalists crazy.
Right.
They just went ape.
Right, and in that speech, it was more than just. It was also a defense of Western civilization. Poland is at the center of Western civilization. So it had an idealistic, if you want to call this Wilsonian rhetoric, fine, that's going to be used sometime, whatever term you want to use. It wasn't that, of course. It was a traditional defense of Western civilization. So he's done that. He did that in withdrawal from the Global Compact and support for conservative governments in Hungary and Poland, that they can determine their own abortion policy, that they can determine their own immigration policy. So these were philosophical, moral positions taken by the Trump administration in the defense of democratic sovereignty and in the defense of traditional values of Western civilization. Supporting traditional Christianity, I would argue also, some will disagree here, traditional Judaism. I mean, also that's an appeal there as well. So it's been a broad defense of the West and Western traditions.
I would agree with that, but I don't think that gainsays my observation that overall, generally speaking, as a president, he did not have a successful term. And presidents without successful terms don't get reelected. On the question of who's on the horizon, one of the things, I wrote a book about the American presidency a few years ago. It's still in print, by the way, if anybody wants to go get it. That made the point that the really significant change agent presidents were never perceived as such beforehand. Lincoln was a kind of a country bumpkin to a lot of people, but not to the American people who voted for him, obviously. And you could say the same thing about FDR. You could say the same thing, not a country bumpkin, but a limited person in a lot of ways, first-rate temperament and a second-rate intellect. Ronald Reagan is another great example. So we just don't know. And that's the sort of the fun part of it, is trying to figure out, okay, who's emerging, who's able to articulate this in a way that can resonate with the American people and pull the American people in the right direction. Those of us on the right could see that in Reagan, but everybody else couldn't. And it took a long time, even after his presidency, for people to understand just how significant and how effective a president he was.
I don't think you can say it's a failed presidency. I think it's a half success, and it started a process that will that'll succeed further down the line.
Well, I think Trump is a historically significant figure. Don't get me wrong on that, for the reasons that you're talking about. And I won't go further into my view.
So therefore, it's not failed. It's pointing the way for something in the future.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, Bob, makes your point about a lack of real intellectual coherence, that under the umbrella of America Firstism, you can find a figure like Mike Pompeo, who is clearly a neoconservative regime change thinker. I mean, he's not in any way an advocate of restraint or even Jacksonianism. He wants to meddle. He wants to meddle in a lot of different countries, and he wants America to get involved in a lot of places that aren't necessarily in our interest to do. And it's a problem for Trumpism and for the future that under that America First umbrella, which is supposed to be assertions of American national interest, don't waste American interests in places that aren't tightly related to what our interests are, that survives and that thrives actually in a Trump administration. Nikki Haley is another example at the UN who, made regular speeches which were philosophically completely unaligned with what Trump really ran on, but it survives. And so there's a possibility that the next successor of Trumpism is not in the right mold.
Well, I think it's going to be a mix of Jacksonian, Hamiltonian. It's not going to be pure Jeffersonian, is what the suggestion is. It's not going to be. Pompeo and the UN speech is interesting. How do we deal with something like Cuba and Venezuela? There was, rhetorical attacks on these tyrannies, which obviously has domestic political purpose. Clearly, we just saw in Florida. So these are, when you get into the actual politics, no one is going to be completely consistent.
Well, you could actually, when you read that UN speech, you could almost tell who wrote which portions of it. And it was divided intellectually. And that's sort of my point. I think
I guess I would argue that political regimes are always divided, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that one of Trump's biggest mistakes from the start of his presidency was not cleaning house, because he brought in all of these establishment figures who were willing to kind of bend and fit themselves into Trumpism, but didn't actually believe in any of it. And that's why he had so much turnover in his administration, because he would very slowly figure out that these people were not actually on his side, and he would have to pick them off one by one. When if he had perhaps trusted his instinct rather than his son-in-law when he was staffing the administration, he probably would have had better luck bringing in people who were actually in line with his values and the things that he ran on.
How in the world did he bring John Bolton in? I mean, there's a question that raises, lots of duplicate questions.
Yeah, and Rex Tillerson, et cetera.
I think he watched a lot of Fox News, right? And said, that guy, let's bring that guy in.
He said nice things about me, so.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes. So maybe each of you, let's do some predictions for the next 4 years. Let's assume a Biden presidency. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but let's assume it. And what will happen in the next 4 years? Where will be the foreign policy problem spots? And what will be the motivation of a Biden administration in handling those?
Well, the big test is China. And a smart nation would be clearing the decks for that. It would be attempting to establish as much stability in the Middle East so that we can move away from there. It would be attempting, now that the whole situation has been poisoned, but attempting to reach some kind of accommodation with Russia and positioning ourselves more clearly in Asia through series of alliances and being firm and strong with China. Basically, the question there is they want us out of Asia, and I don't think we want to get out of Asia. So how are we going to find some kind of a mutual accommodation, or is that going to come to a clash? And that's the fundamental foreign policy question that we face. It's profound.
I completely agree with that. My other concern under a Biden presidency is what happens with Russia, because I think there's grown up pathology on the left about Russia and its threat to the U.S. And that's not to say Russia's not a threat, but they've allowed it to grow to this place that's not healthy. And when you think about things like Russiagate or the fact that they were even mad that Trump shook hands with Putin, I'm worried that we're going to get back to this place where Russia becomes public enemy number one, and perhaps what follows is foreign policy that's not particularly smart or restrained under a Biden administration. But obviously China would be the foremost biggest challenge that we're looking at over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think, Biden will return to a Obama soft Wilsonian approach. I mean, China is obviously, he has to deal with China, so that's a problem. But I think the key factor will be the continued polarization. There's two views of America. you know, there's a blue America. There isn't one America. There's a red America and a blue America, and this is certainly going to be very powerful domestically, but it'll go into foreign policy. At this point, politics, you know, that old don't stop at the water's edge, that's totally gone. And I think foreign policy will be intensely political. And I think there is a chance that Republican opposition will be more nationalist, more democratic, and also probably attacking a weak China policy. They'll be able to score political points that way. So I see more polarization, more intensity, two foreign policy visions clashing. But obviously, if Biden is winning, they're going to have the upper hand for a while. But that opposition was going to be building.
Well, let's just leave it on that insightful note. Bob, Amber, John, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks.